next issue we're going to look at is survey construction and administration. The construction of the surveys themselves can often influence the responses. One important area this can occur in is in loaded questions. Loaded questions are when the statement has been intentionally worded to encourage a particular desired response. Take a moment and look at the differences in opinions for the two differently ordered questions on page 9 through 10. Notice that the inclusion of the specification of eliminating waste greatly increased the likelihood of individuals to respond yes to the assessment of whether the president should have the line item veto power. Notice that when what the particular veto would be for, there was a much lower response in supporting this attitude. Applying this to current issues, we can consider the possible differences in response you might get for the following questions. Should the Affordable Care Act be repealed, or should Obamacare be repealed? Though Obamacare and the ACA are the same thing, differences in the titles used might influence responses. Another place to pay attention in survey construction is the order of questions. This raises the issue of priming. Priming is how the exposure to one stimulus, such as a question, influences the response to another stimulus, such as a later question. It's a product of memory and is very difficult to work around. Priming can occur within a particular question. So again, looking back at your text, look at the differences in attributions of the problem for the two differently ordered questions on page 10. Notice that though both questions ask the same information and indeed include almost the exact same words, the order of which item is listed first influences the person's likelihood to attribute the problem of air pollution to that particular event. So when traffic was listed first, that was the one most people blamed. When industry was listed first, that was the one that most people blamed. Lastly, priming can occur within a survey itself. So your response to the question, what advice would you give to an incoming USF freshman if I had first asked you what has been the best parts about attending USF, or what have been the worst parts about attending USF? Based on what we know about priming, we would assume that if I had asked you first about the best parts, then your advice would have had a more positive tone. If I'd asked you first about the worst parts, your advice would have had a slightly more negative tone and cautions. In fact, this is exactly the pattern when we do this activity in class. Now, another thing we have to pay attention to in survey administration is testing effects or order effects. This occurs when assessment is affected by previous prior testing experiences. We'll look at this again later on in the semester when we look at pre-test, post-test designs. Basically, in brief, having you guys take a particular test and then having you take it again later, even without any intervention, your recall will go up. In fact, when we're looking at the SAT test, we find that individuals who've taken an SAT test and then taken a second one later with absolutely no intervention training whatsoever still show a higher increase in the performance on the second SAT, simply because they've gotten more familiar with the approach and design of the test. Now, this was a particularly big problem when I was working on a project with the Georgia Board of Regents and we were running a statewide usability readiness assessment. This particular study was designed to look at the quality of online tools available across the state. We were looking at students' ability to engage in a series of tasks fully online at various institutions. Some examples of these tasks include ordering books, registering for classes, reading the college paper, or making an appointment with your advisor. Now, the problem that comes up with this is that once you've gotten used to negotiating an issue on a particular website, it's easier for you to negotiate the next similar issue on that website, i.e. most university websites are designed in a pretty coherent manner. That means if I'm timing how long it takes you to order your textbooks, it might depend upon whether or not you've done other activities on that site already. So, the solution for this is what we call Solomon 4-group design. This is a pattern of where you administer the task so that each activity is accounted in each possible order. The example below shows you a small version of what we did when we were doing the Georgia Board of Regents assessments. As you can see, each group engages in all 4 activities. However, the order is altered. So the order of textbooks occurs first in group 1, second in group 2, third in group 3, and fourth in group 4. If you take a moment and look over these arrangements, you'll notice that in fact each of these 4 activities across these 4 groups occurs in a different order. This means that when I collapse all the data across all 4 groups, any possible order effects will cancel each other out. This is a really important part of research design. It can be a little complicated to do, but it is really critical when you're looking at possible testing and order effects for a study. Now, the next thing we need to look at is survey administration. And here we're looking at social desirability effect plus observation effect. Social desirability is the human tendency to present ourselves to our best advantage, and this includes in keeping with social norms and values that are endorsed by our culture. This is a really common human trait. The other trait, observation effect, is the alteration of behavior due to awareness of being observed. This is a real problem whenever you're conducting research, as individuals tend to know that you're observing them, and then they thus alter their behavior. You can think about how your behavior might change in class when you're there as a regular student and with the instructor, and then when you have a faculty member in there doing some form of observation for the instructor. Notice how you might change your behavior just a little bit, even though you know you're not the one being studied. Now imagine how that would change your behavior if you knew that you were the one being studied. An important example of this was a study done published in 1994 looking at women's expressions of violence. This study asked women to record whether or not they'd experienced gender-related violence on campus. In the anonymous condition, they found that women were much more likely to report that they had in fact experienced some form of gender-related violence on campus rather than in the non-anonymous condition. In the non-anonymous condition, although the individuals were assured of confidentiality, they still had to sign a consent form listing their name, and thus it was still recorded they did participate in the study, even though you wouldn't be able to tell what their particular results were. However, attaching our name to it is simply enough to make us feel affected by the social desirability effect and the observation effect. Combined with the fact that unfortunately our current culture tends to act like women who've been sexually assaulted have somehow engaged in a behavior that elicits it, this made individuals participating in the study less likely to report gender-related violence than if they in fact had a completely anonymous condition and did not have to sign a consent form at all. Another important example of this was looking at the polls in the Clinton-Obama Democratic presidential nomination. Early polls indicated that a substantial number of voters would vote for a qualified female candidate. However, the results did not support this. What exactly happened? Well, an important study published in 2007 shows that an indirect method indicated that 26% of the U.S. voter population described themselves as upset or angry about a prospective female president. However, because expressing attitudes about an individual solely because of their gender is considered not appropriate in our society, these individuals did not feel comfortable specifying this in a more directly worded method of assessment. Again, when we're looking at this type of issue, what are some possible solutions? Well, the study in 2008 shows that questions that tap into social norms and values actually yield more accurate reports of behavior in online or automatically dialed phone calls. Here, the individual feels relatively anonymous and are much more likely to report their actual behaviors that violate particular social norms or are considered not as valuable and approved of as our society. Examples of this include individuals being more likely to report that they engaged in speeding in the last year when they're contacted via an anonymous approach rather than an approach that uses their name. This also affects individuals' reports and frequency of attending church and other social norms.